Isn't it great to be, I just can't believe it's a year since the last open symposium, when, as you say, it felt like a different world. And so thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm always delighted to collaborate with the Centre, you know, on the annual symposium, but also on all sorts of other things too. You know, it's an incredibly valuable peak body, creating leadership in this space. And of course, it is to all those that are affiliated with the Centre. Like, I can't believe we've got a week-long series of sessions, but as you were saying, you know, we couldn't fit into just, you know, a short period of time the amount and the vibrancy of the work that's happening in Victoria at the moment. So I think it's so exciting to be here. It's lovely to have so many people who are going to be part of this session. Let me also thank Kelly Hunter for her very warm and very informative welcome. She has really become, you know, a great sort of linchpin of this this event as well, and she makes a difference to us in the way in which we start off to really think about our connections that go back a long way, in which we need to honour. And so now it's a great pleasure for me to be introducing Dr. Penny Hagen. This is very exciting for us to be welcoming someone from across the ditch. She's been sponsored by Clear Horizons. They're leaders in working with change makers to design and evaluate solutions for people, place and planet. They specialise in measuring impact and building skills and systems to create and measure meaningful change. So Dr. Penny Hagen is currently the director of the Auckland Design Lab, and I know that many of you have already had such wonderful interactions with her, and she's made a difference to lots of people, both here and in New Zealand. She assists organisations and teams to apply participatory and developmental approaches to the design and implementation of strategy, programs, policies and services with a social outcomes focus. Penny's work sits at the intersection of design, wellbeing and systems change. She's worked from across New Zealand and Australia with community, academic and commercial sectors to support locally based solutions to complex health and social issues. So Penny, it's great to be able to welcome you. We're delighted to have you here, and we're so looking forward to hearing from you. For everybody, just notice the housekeeping there, and to know that this is going to be a dynamic session. You're not just going to be sitting back and listening. You will be asked to engage. Can I just say a little housekeeping moment? When you go into breakout rooms, remember to turn your video on. Okay, over to you, Penny.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to put my screen up, so I'll just do a screen swap. Fantastic. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you very much for the welcome, and really to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where some of you are gathering, and acknowledge Kathy for the introduction and the welcome to place for the Wurundjeri people. To say thank you to our hosts this morning. It's a real pleasure to join you from over here, and I'm glad that even though we can't be in the same city, we can be on the same time conversation. Just acknowledge Deb and the work of the team, and also to the Minister, both the Minister and Kelly, for setting some really key kind of concepts for our conversation this morning in terms of place and in terms of a focus on outcomes and what it takes for us to understand what makes the difference for families. So, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi no tamaki makaurau hau ko Penny Hagen takawinga. My name is Penny and I come from Auckland. I'm Pākehā or tau iwi, which means non-Indigenous New Zealander. The land that I stand on today is Tamaki Makaurau, and that can be translated as the land of many lovers or desirability. It's a very beautiful place with many resources, and there are 19 different tribal authorities or iwi that whakapapa to this land, so that have living and active connections to the land and whenua and the mountains here. So it's a place of very rich and also intense and troubled, very troubled at times history, and that place here and the connection to place is a really critical context for how we work. I'd just also like to really again acknowledge it's a Monday morning off the back of some really long weeks for lots of people on this call, people that have been working really hard, just in really responsive ways, and I just acknowledge that there's probably lots of places people could be, and that this is a really special occasion for us to connect, but that it's been a really tough and stressful year. And some of the things that I'll try and kind of talk to today are how we're thinking about doing our work, but holding in view that bigger system. And I think that the scenario that we've had this year with the pandemic really brings home the significance of that holistic way of understanding our connection to planet and to each other. And it's really brought that to the fore for many of us. And I just give my heart to Melbourne, who I know you have a really tough couple of months, and we've been thinking of you guys in Victoria. So it's a pleasure to connect with you all again. And I'm just going to share today, always in the spirit of kind of sharing our learning. We work in a way that we describe as practice-based evidence, and I'm sharing with you things that lots of what I'll share may be incredibly familiar, and the things that you're working to do. And really what we're trying to do is figure out ways to communicate this and to realise different alternatives. And so it's more, in a way, testing some ideas with you and seeing how they work and how they fit, and perhaps building a conversation together about how we can progress this work. So it's offered very much in the spirit of us being on a journey. I'm speaking on behalf of a team who works really hard, and I've just got the privileged space of being able to share some of that learning that many of them work in their own communities. It's a public holiday here today, so there's no one else in the office except for me. But I just really want to acknowledge that what I'm sharing is very much a collective effort with the team and with families, and also with a range of different other partners that we work with. And I know that people on this call just bring a lot of experience and perspective, and so we're going to create opportunities to connect that and share with each other around us. So for those of you who I haven't connected with before, I'll just give a little bit of context for the lab. Excuse me, I've just got an enormous drink bottle. So from a government perspective, I'm just locating where we are in the world. The Auckland Co-design Lab sits in that little middle space there. We have our feet on the ground in South Auckland, which is a place of very rich diversity and culture. And we're part of the local government, so we have kind of connections into all our local government places and spaces, but we're also funded by central government. So we try and act as a conduit between what's happening with communities on the ground and how policies are impacting and affecting their lives back to policymakers, and bring some proximity and exchange between those worlds. So the lived realities of people and their capacity to influence on how we think about how we shape policy. So we occupy a funny little space there, but we're very much, through the teams that I work alongside, have our feet on the ground in Tāmaki Here Here Ki Tonga. So the Southern Initiative, South Auckland, which is a local government place-based initiative led primarily by Māori practitioners and also Pacific practitioners working with their communities. It has a mandate for social, economic, community and environmental and cultural innovation, and it's absolutely place-based. So I really connected with the introduction that Kelly gave. It's culturally grounded in its practice and response and values led. And really the work of this team, along with all of our partners and collaborators, is about moving towards new norms. So the kinds of norms and attitudes and outcomes that are happening now are not outcomes that contribute to the well-being of these communities. And so we're looking for new narratives, a different scenario where there's healthy connections to environment, Indigenous knowledge is normalised as a practice and celebrated. So there's new norms that we're working towards, place-based, local responses, families leading their own change. So this is what drives and sits at the heart of our work. So we are very much connected also to working with children, families, and our government lens of child and youth wellbeing strategy is a sort of framework through which we try and connect and think about all our work. So in terms of today, what I want to share, I want to share with you some learning that we're doing about how to talk about the idea of a wider ecology of support, so the idea of activating and really supporting all the possible places, spaces, people, natural supports that exist in our communities to support wellbeing and to rebalance around equity. So what we're learning about how we can lean into that, talk about that, think about that, and make that possible. To do that, I'm going to share a little bit about where we start in our work and how we work. If there's time, I'll also talk a little bit about how we think about outcomes and tracking outcomes. And then at the end, there'll be a sort of reflection just around the readiness for us to work differently and what we're learning about some of the challenges and small actions that we can take to move into different kinds of practice. So this is really relevant, I guess, to what we've seen in the last 8 months too, in terms of COVID, and how important it's been to understand all the different natural, cultural, social supports and fabrics that exist in our community to support each other through times of really significant change and stress. And so it's really shown up to us the importance of building this wider ecology of support. I hope there are things in here that are useful. I'm hoping that people can just take out bits and kind of reflect on those. And please do use the chat to introduce yourself, say where you're from, and also any comments or questions as we go. And I know Kathy's going to be monitoring those. So I have had the opportunity to introduce myself and talk a little bit about my work and where I come from. And now I would very much like give that opportunity to everybody that's joined us today in a normal or a different, non-virtual symposium. We would have the opportunity to bump into each other at the coffee table, or as we all tried to squash into the door, or we sat down or tripped over each other's chair. We don't get that opportunity unless we make time for it in these kind of forums. And so we want to start by enabling you to connect at the beginning of this week and this morning and just meet somebody else who's on the call. So I'm going to ask you just to think about something first. One of the things that I'll be talking to is this idea of kind of big and little, so working locally, focused on the work that we have to do every day and the things we need to pay attention to, but also holding in our minds this bigger picture all the time of what else is happening and what's supporting or not supporting wellbeing outcomes across the system. And for those of you who are familiar with the socio-ecological model of layers that influence, this is my very simplistic version of that, the idea of us in our communities, but also surrounded by many, many things in place that some things we can see and some that we can't, that influence conditions for wellbeing. So these are big concepts to hold in our daily practice. So I just want to give everyone the opportunity to think for a minute in your own world, wherever you are. And I know people on this call are from all sorts of different parts of practice and have different levels of connectivity to policy issues or issues on the ground with families. But just take a minute to think about how much you feel that your work in its day-to-day practice lets you grapple with some of the bigger issues of well-being and equity. So just take a minute. I'm going to stop talking for 30 seconds so you can just think about that. It's a big question for a Monday morning, but I think already in the introductions we've had kind of some of those big challenges set for us. So I'm just going to pause for 30 seconds and invite people to think about that. Yeah, everybody's back.
Is everybody back?
Everyone's back.
Yes,
Okay.
everyone's back. Awesome.
Great,
thank you. Okay, great. So as I said before, one of the things that we I guess we feel all the time that we're kind of grappling with and trying to understand, and also grappling to help our collaboration partners to be able to hold as well, is that idea of working in place in particular communities with families and connected to particular neighbourhoods, but also holding the big picture of the system's conditions, and in particular keeping in view when we're making decisions and we're thinking about what we're doing and we're trying to work together, the historical and structural conditions that contribute to where we're at now and either continue to compound inequity or help to rebalance it. So we've got this kind of tension all the time between working small and kind of thinking big. And one of the things that I know, theoretically it's really easy to hold this understanding that there's many things that influence the conditions for well-being and that influence the potential for outcomes. But one of the challenges is that the energy, even though I can look out on the street here and I can think of structurally, environmentally, policy-wise, in terms of behaviours and interactions, people could be walking around this neighbourhood and either be having a kind of a strengthening experience that strengthens their identity, builds social connections, or they could be experiencing something that actually compounds inequity, depending on how we've designed things and what we've been mindful of. And even though we know that there are this kind of ecology that we could be thinking about to influence well-being, we've become very fixated on a service response. And this is not an anti-service thing, but it is about how habitually over time and how we've organised particularly government funding, resources and ideas of metrics and measurement, services have kind of become a vortex, particularly crisis services for energy. And it's been very hard for us then to think about putting investment and balancing in other areas. We've sort of, as the Minister said, got into a bit of a cycle of crisis response that makes it very hard then to shift out of responding and reacting to immediately what's going on. And in a way, the pandemic is sort of indicative of that. We've got to now react really immediately to this health crisis, but still hold in our minds the relationship environmentally that created the scenario. And so we've had to sort of start naming this blue dot that's kind of got this almost black hole-like power of pulling our energy and our resourcing. And it's sometimes really hard to think beyond a service response. So we identify a problem and we think we'll develop a service that responds to that problem. And of course, more services isn't going to address inequity at a systemic level. So we've been looking at how, and there's awesome services, and like I say, this is not against services per se, but often, particularly in our context, services don't reach the people that they're intended for. If they do, they can actually be harmful or re-traumatise, but they're often shaped in a deficit lens or a very Eurocentric worldview and are not culturally grounded. And often when there's really good work happening in them, it's not the work they're funded for or procured for anyway. Frontline workers and practitioners are doing amazing things, almost in spite sometimes of how contracts and systems are set up in order to do the things that matter for families. Of course, I'm making some big generalizations, but what we're sort of thinking and trying to articulate is that if we keep starting in the same place, we get the same outcomes. And I think the Minister was, on a different level saying a similar thing. And so what are the different start points and different places to start that allow us to think more broadly? And that's what we've been trying to kind of grapple with and articulate and communicate and put our energy towards. So I'm going to just share with you, this is fairly, it's just emerging in terms of us learning how to talk about it and what we're trying to achieve and how we're testing different things. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this with you at the beginning of the week and hope that it supports the right kind of conversations. I suddenly felt a huge amount of pressure at the introduction about being the first conversation that you guys get to have. So just a little bit about what we do then. The key thing for us is we're working with families and young people in neighbourhoods, in location, alongside them and collaborators and systems partners, so that's government, philanthropy, cultural institutions, schools, all the the groups that have capacity for influence on wellbeing. We work together to understand what's going on and to try new things. So we're trying to experiment all the time with what compelling alternatives look like. And the way that we do this, we call it a practice-based evidence. So we draw on lived experience of families and the expertise of people working in the system. We do draw on Western science where it's appropriate, and we prioritise Indigenous knowledge or mātauranga. And that in itself is a new starting point, because it, in a small way, because it privileges a different kind of expertise than what the system habitually tends to rely on. So the kinds of things that we might be doing with families include working with young people and their families and schools to understand what makes school a place that you want to be at and helps you stay connected to learning, and what is it that actually pushes young people out of the system. And there's large groups of young people for whom school is not a safe space. It's not a space that actually sets them up for prosperity and family wealth. And so why is that? What is it that's going on inside those systems, and what would it look like for those systems to be more empathetic and supportive and recognise the aspirations of young people, which very often is to support their families. And working with parents of very small children, babies in the first 1,000 days, what is it that would support them to create the conditions to nurture their children in the way that they aspire to? What is it that helps to reduce stress for families that live under the unreasonable burden of toxic stress and inequity and marginalisation? What does it look like when the system is a nurturing system for them or a generous system for them? So we work together to understand what's going on and then look for ways that we can try out new things, usually led by those families or young people themselves. So they decide what it is they're interested in and they work on that. The thing that's important underneath this is that it's about how we do it, not so much what we do it. So it's values-based, it's relationship-driven, and we're really interested in how we build the capacity of people and of our systems partners to operate differently through the process. So as we're doing it, we're generating new knowledge about what works, practice-based evidence, and we're also modelling and examining what it takes to change, largely what it takes to change the system to operate differently. And it's much easier to say it than to do it. So that's kind of a bit of a sense of how we operate. And so then I'm just going to share with you some of the things that we have heard from families and young people when we work with them about what's important. And again, I'm sure I won't be telling you things that aren't familiar to you. Our sort of work that we're trying to do is how to hold this in view and how to design for it and how to work with particularly government partners about how we would invest, procure and commission and track if we were going to work in this way. So this includes things like, right now, many services don't work for people and they compound things, and they often require people to be in crisis before they can access support. So families may go to an office where and say, look, you know, I'm really close to losing my home or losing my job or losing my relationship, and they're not fit the criteria yet. As soon as those crises hit, then they can fit the criteria for things. So it kind of keeps people in this space where even where they want to actively seek support, they can't access it. The supports that are useful for people include natural and Indigenous responses, so family-to-family responses or cultural responses that tend not to be legitimised or recognised within our service system. Not entirely, but most commonly. Families want spaces to heal and spaces for respite, and they want to do that proactively, not just after crisis. So we might be working with families with small children. They really want to be the most amazing parents that they can be, but what they need right now is help to heal. So they will proactively ask for that and look for that kind of support. They don't have to have gone through a crisis intervention first and followed through on the kind of prevention intervention cycle. They'll actively know that there's a whole lot of stuff going on for them that they would like some support with. And spaces and places can be sites of healing and support by the way they're shaped. Doesn't have to be services. So how do people feel when they're in libraries or health spaces or public spaces or schools? How do they feel, and how are those environments supporting them? To heal, to take time out. Sometimes it's just a moment of rest when life is really stressful and chaotic. Just the time to be able to think and make some decisions. one of the things that we have to kind of keep trying to work to keep visible all the time is that the status quo isn't neutral. So our social health, education, community spaces can further entrench shame and inequity. So going in to look for support may be a humiliating experience, and in part that's why some families choose not to. They, instead of being hard to reach families, they're actually protecting themselves by isolating themselves, and that's a show of agency, and taking control is to not engage. And so kind of flipping that understanding of how the protective factors that people use when they're under enormous amounts of stress. But also when we look historically at things like schools here, and we know that there was really active racist policy in schools around Māori language, for example, and that racist policy still has legacy. It has memory in its family, and it has legacy in the way our systems were set up. So if you're a young person coming from a family who was ostracized from school or shut out from school through legal means historically, we're actually in a space of healing, not a primary prevention space, because there's, that space is not neutral in that broader context. Sometimes all people need is the opportunity to build social capital and strong connections. So we see when we're working with families, rather than needing to necessarily go into a service, if they've got the capacity to build up that social connection, social capital, and the space and the opportunity and the confidence, they then can start leading the responses themselves and resolving things themselves. We know that we can invest in our environments in ways that acknowledge trauma and help to rebalance proactively and intentionally. We're doing quite a lot of work here with our public spaces and libraries and things like that, thinking about this. We know that families and young people really want to support each other and that they have the capacity to do so, but often we're not, we haven't figured out the best ways to support that to happen and create the platforms for that to happen. And the opportunities to lead and to be heard are in and of themselves healing and strengthening and help to do rebalancing in the space. So these are just examples. I think there's one more. Support and strength comes from friends, networks, sports, clubs, you know, the places where people live, work, play, and trust. And that's where people want to see the things that matter to them and do their work. What we often do is construct our services and responses a long way away from that natural ecology of support. So these are just things that we see in here. And like I say, I'm sure many of them will be very familiar. But what these show up for us when we look at this thing, and this is across all of our work, not just one or two initiatives, kind of consistently over time, this real potential of the wider ecology of support to be activated, but a real struggle getting our systems to reconfigure around these kinds of potential, and wanting to try and test ways that we can really promote well-being as opposed to kind of staying in the status quo. So we've started to reconceptualize, well, what does that look like? How do we design in for that? So the kinds of things we're seeing is that what helps doesn't need to be a service. So this sort of blue dot. There's actually lots of different ways that we can respond and support people, whether it be through natural supports, cultural supports. We also know that places and spaces and services can be strengthening, so they can enhance protective factors just through the nature of how we behave and act. It doesn't have to be through a program or service, although we can do those kinds of things, but we can create spaces and interactions and supports in ways that enable to lead their own change. And we also know that lots of spaces are not neutral and that we have to do proactive rebalancing around healing, and start with healing in some places. So that needs to be the start point. So it's sort of when we think, for us, it wasn't working when we were thinking at a kind of systems level and thinking about schools and spaces to hold to the primary prevention, intervention, early intervention, restoration cycle. That didn't make sense when actually the spaces themselves needed to be healing spaces and rebalance through historic means, or when families and young people wanted to start with healing. So this was important to kind of move away from that idea of where those different responses and interventions might be and think of it more holistically. What this tells us, though, when we think about how we've configured our systems and contracts and resourcing around this, is that most of the changes needed to happen to activate these things are actually inward systems changes, not outward community behaviours. And again, one of the things that we tend to consistently do in government is if there's an issue, we look out to the community and we think, that's broken, how are we going to fix it? What needs to change there? We don't very often do as much looking back to ourselves and saying, what are we doing to create the conditions or to hold the status quo in place? We commission work and then we evaluate the program, but we don't evaluate our own work to shift the system influences or to ensure successful outcomes from those things. So we're trying to really encourage that inward looking and inward kind of critique, I guess, of how the system is actually organising around wellbeing. So these three things have become a sort of a design tool, I guess, for us to think about when we're designing for equity and intergenerational wellbeing. These three things have to be balanced equally and be in place. So at the moment, we tend to lean down to that responding space and in that the blue dot, but actually we really, really need to balance across to healing and strengthening and spread our investment and our focus across all these areas. Thinking about it in this way is very simple, but also in some ways harder than we would think, excuse me, to hold this balance, but it helps remind us that the responsibility for change and the creating conditions for change is shared across all parts of the system, not just within families. So what I would like to do is just offer this as a kind of just a thinking tool, and we've used it in a number of different ways, but right now I just want to, I've sort of gone blah, and downloaded a bunch of things, and I just want to offer the opportunity for you to think about how does this stuff come up in your world. And so I don't know what's going to happen when we try and do breakout groups in a minute, and we'll worry about that in a second, but what I would like people to think about, not necessarily so much about the Tokutoro model, which is the unbreakable three, and one of the things about this model is that you can come in anywhere and you can go in any direction. So that's the critical part of how it's been visualized. The things I would like you to think about, pick one of these maybe, and I'll ask if someone can put these questions into the chat, is in what ways are these things possible or already active in your world? And these are the things that I would invite you just to have sort of a little bit of a think about. Either working beyond services, so thinking about, and it might be as part of a service, thinking about how spaces, ways of working, including natural, holistic, cultural, indigenous support. So in what ways is your space or world already working or could work more into that? What about challenging the idea of neutral spaces and thinking about how spaces can actually start being levers for healing and rebalancing of how communities look and feel? A focus on structural conditions and systems, not on services. How is that enabled through your work? And then the last one is how much of that looking inward at systems and how much systems are compounding is possible for you to do. And looking at the system behaviours, not just out and thinking about who needs fixing or to change their behaviour. So we're going to, fingers crossed, see if we can get into slightly smaller groups just to kind of unpack, think about how this either resonates or doesn't, or these kind of questions in your work, and just chat for, if it does work, maybe 15 minutes. But let's just cross our fingers and see what happens in a minute, and if you all disappear and then we come back again and have a bit of a chat about that. So I'm just going to pause and see if the breakout rooms manifest. Minimum things that have to be in place. I need to be able to put baby down safely, heat food, talk to others like me if I want to, feel welcome, and the fifth one's just falling out of my head. Oh, be able to change baby. Those are pretty simple criteria for being able to be in a safe place, and most of our spaces didn't have those, and there was various legislation, rules, reasons why that was the case, and we needed to go and unpack that and say, actually, is this really a role that you can't have a change table? What's going on here? So sometimes they're really simple things like that, where they've just prioritized the things that actually allow babies and parents to build nurturing relationships. So we look at that system change at the local level. So who are we working with right now? And then we look at how we can amplify that change in behavior or mindset or attitude or prioritization within national policy or legislation or other contexts. Sometimes, I mean, that's never a clean, straightforward thing, but we're constantly looking for where has that shift in the way of working been amplified either through, say, all libraries or taken out across the whole health service, or started to move up into policy making where we might do things like within our family violence context, think about how we have to prioritise children before they're born, and very early children in the support families are getting as a kind of major piece of our thinking around prevention. So we follow that kind of tracking of what's shifting and what behaviours are shifting, and try and amplify that as much as possible locally and then up and down the system. So those are the things that we're trying to pay attention to when we're thinking about, is it making a difference? And it happens through the way that we work, and the modelling of different ways of working that then is taken up by others. And of course, we're by no means the only people doing that, but that amplification and the principles is where the scaling comes from, not the intervention was amazing and we replicate the intervention. So much more about the how and the values that are being emulated than the what. So that's just a different way for us thinking about learning and tracking and what's important, and how that leans us into thinking about working differently. So that's a thought that I often invite teams to take back for them, and we won't pause there today, but it is something that I think really helps us kind of flip a mirror on ourselves and think, you know, what are we valuing? And often what we value isn't necessarily what the contract says we have to value, and that in itself opens up a really interesting conversation about what's happening and what the system is enabling or kind of compounding. So the last bit that I'm just going to touch on before I hand over to Kathy to sort of weave magic and things is this idea of the readiness for this, and what we're learning about what it actually means to try and start in different places, to shift to that balance, to recognise and activate the wider ecology of support that is available, and for kind of holding that big and little view all the time. So working locally in place, but connecting back up to systems. So some of the things that we is kind of like the rub for us when we, and like I say, just as much internally council systems as any other partner or group that we're working with. These are some of the places where we really find the tension. And that's the legitimacy of alternatives. So people being able to genuinely support, believe, and infrastructure and resource, say, family to family responses or natural structured responses, cultural responses. Building the capability for sharing power and decision making is huge. We say that we want to do that a lot, but actually when push comes to shove, we're very poor at it. Valuing systems, structures and environments as equivalent to intervention. So we're good at that theoretically, but again, when we look at what we're investing in and what we name as even primary prevention, it's usually a program of some kind. So we keep defaulting back to that as our only lever when there are so many others. And cultivating capacity to look inwards as well as outwards. So we're really always pushing government, especially when they're commissioning work and they're creating their evaluation frameworks. Where is the evaluative question that looks back on the capacity of the system to enable success? How are we, as government, asking the people we work with, are we supporting you? Did this work for you? And there's been some really great examples of that during the COVID response, where governments had to step to the one side of leading organisations that knew their communities or know their people. So in particular here, iwi or tribal authorities who were in front of setting up for safety for their families. And it was a really visceral example of needing to be a support for somebody else's leadership and community. And so us getting better at embedding that in everything that we do. And then this naming of the crisis vortex and how powerful that is for drawing our resources out and our energy and needing to find creative alternatives. So those are our kind of areas that we find that we're focused on the most. This is the last slide to leave you with, which is that the big system stuff can be really overwhelming, and people are already, you know, working, sometimes it feels like 4 different jobs. And I feel like working in place and working in system is 2 things at the same time, holding both things at the same time. But we can't get away anymore with sort of saying, oh, that's out of scope, which is something that actually design practice used to be very good at, saying, oh, I've got to de-scope it. But actually, if we keep doing that, we just keep coming back to kind of simple ideas and looking for silver bullets and things. But regardless of where we are in the system, big and little, and people will have already been putting stuff in the chat, I know, and talking about it, that we all have the capacity to be shifting those norms in small and big ways. And often when we have these conversations with teams, they give awesome examples of the kinds of things that they're doing. It might be around language or the way that the questions they ask that mean that at every level we're able to start modeling this kind of rebalancing practice. So some of the questions or ways that we see is through the language and framing that we use. How do we talk about people? What words do we use to describe things? What do we choose to value and track? What questions do we ask? What are we curious about? Do we ask about, well, how did that work and what did they feel about that and what's going on? Through how we choose to share power, big and small. Through our behaviours, are we welcoming people? And the last one, manaakitanga, which is it's a Māori concept which doesn't translate in its full richness, but the idea of generosity and kindness and hospitality, and that's a core value of the Māori worldview, is the idea of manaakitanga, and it's actually at its simplest the thing that our spaces and services should do fundamentally is care for each other, care for ourselves and care for each other. So do we demonstrate that in the way that we work? So these are just small start points that we often see teams are already able to give great examples of how they're doing that. For us, it helps us not to be overwhelmed by the enormity of it, in the sense that we can all be operating in some ways to reflect these things that we value. So I'm just going to leave it there and say thank you to all of you for your patience with our zooming in and out of things, and also to all the families and young people that contributed to us being able to share this knowledge with our different teams. And I'll just hand it over to Kathy now. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Penny. And Oliver, can you put us all on gallery, or do we need to do that ourselves?
If everyone just goes to the top right-hand corner of their screen and where it says view, and just switch to gallery mode, gallery view.
Oops. Sorry, I'm just doing it myself and taking a moment to do it. Oh, Penny, thank you so much. What an interesting and stimulating talk. And I guess like everybody else in the room, virtual, in inverted commas, appreciate the way you worked to allow us to have chats, which is a terrific way to open the symposium. So thank you for kind of being creative and thinking about the technology and how we could use it in this way. And I guess others also would be, I guess for me it was very thought-provoking about, my own history as a social worker, where my first 5 or 6 years was in community development. And in a way, thinking about how I reckon that was foundational for me, because it was my first 5 or 6 years, and that I continue to sort of think in ways, even now as an academic, which have been influenced by that early work in the community development space. I guess that was one thought. Another thought was, so I'm just going to give you my quick reflections, and then, we've got so much chat and interesting things happening. A couple of reflections. I guess we're just in the process of setting up a round table or a workshop on the lost issue of social support, because when we've done evaluations, it came particularly out of doing evaluations of a couple of group work programs where you look at, that is supposed to be about supporting social connection. But when we did the eco maps at time 1 and time 2, what happened was that we could see that women were connected into the service system, but they had almost, the aridness of their social connection would make you weep. And it made us realise that notion of getting past a kind of a psychological approach to trauma-informed approaches, which has got terribly psychological and behavioural because you can measure it, to actually what does it mean to reconnect this woman with her community, because actually that's the third, that's the final stage of recovery from trauma, is expanding into and reconnecting out of isolation. And I felt really sort of that we need to re-engage with this space, and this has been such a great sort of platform, Penny, that you've provided to go, and it makes me think about that old adage about well, you know, if I was beginning, I wouldn't begin. If I was starting again, I wouldn't begin here. And, you know, it's like, where do we begin? And I know that all of you will be also going, well, in my organisation, you know, down in Geelong, we're doing all this work with the football club or whatever, you know, that there's lots of sort of little spaces where this is happening. So it'd be great to sort of have people's thoughts. And I really want to pick up on it, and at Michelle's stuff around actually, you know, we do what we can measure. And so we need to sort of think about this again. So who, maybe just starting with Annette. Annette, do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yes, happy to. Just trying to remember to turn myself off mute. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and thank you so much, Penny. That was just incredibly thought-provoking and engaging. Really interested in, you know, reflecting on what the Minister said about evidence-based programs and practice and outcomes being so important. That, I mean, this is such an important area. How do we measure progress towards healing, progress towards strengthening, and progress towards, you know, those connecting capacities? And you mentioned things like, I think some of our programs definitely measure things like parenting confidence and parenting self-efficacy, but those other more kind of tenuous things, I think we're going to have to get clever about how we measure those things in order to get government funding for them. We know they're important, but what are some ways of measuring healing and strengthening, so progress towards, and I think you gave us some hints at that, but I'd love to hear a bit more from you about what you maybe have done in New Zealand to kind of break through so that we can get this important work funded.
Yeah, thank you, Annette. I guess we're trying to work on multiple fronts, and along with a lot of other folks on this journey. So we're absolutely having conversations at that sort of treasury, you know, business funding, budget bid type level. Like, how do you rethink funding for capacity? One of the key parts of it is funding for learning, because you want teams to say to you, you know, this is what we're discovering about getting towards better outcomes. Because right now what we're measuring is, it doesn't really tell us those things. We might know whether there's an assessment that's been done, doesn't tell you whether the assessment resulted in something better for families. So we're absolutely having that sort of structural conversation, and I think there's some really interesting experiments internationally about how we might do that. There's fits and starts of attempts, so there is definitely learning that's live across different spots in New Zealand, and I suspect also in Australia, about what that looks like. It's definitely tricky in terms of getting the capacity to, I guess, reconfigure the structures. And one of the biggest things for us is to be investing in time and relationships so that people can actually think about how they work collectively together. But I think the interesting thing about the sort of how we measure this stuff is that a lot of our high level outcomes that we might look at for, say, our general social surveys, or for us, it's things like our big outcomes that we put in our child and youth wellbeing strategy, which are things like feeling safe and loved, feeling connected to identity, being able to have continued learning. Those are really powerful, positive, strength-based driven indicators. And we can ask people about those things, about the strength of their social connectedness and things. What happens is that a big gap opens up in between those sort of national level understandings of wellbeing and then what we measure and track at a service level. And so we're sort of trying to do experiments about how do you bring that down, even on a micro level, like at a library. If we said stop thinking about books and how many people went to the program and how many people are members, and start thinking and starting to track how welcome do people feel, you know, how many of your community members are coming now that wouldn't come before, how many babies are there. Do people feel like they've strengthened their social connection as a result? And those become the indicators for success of something like a library, which acts as a, you know, an anchor institution in a community. So we're trying to experiment with locally defined and in some cases culturally defined indicators, and then so we're working kind of top and bottom to see then how you figure out the connections in the middle. because actually working out the indicators isn't too hard. People can express those to us, and quite often it's reconfiguring the system to pay attention to those things. Yeah, so it's a work in progress is I guess what I would say.
Penny, I'm just wondering whether anyone here, so thank you for that, Penny. I'm just wondering whether anyone's working, I'm thinking about the Australian Developmental Index and how that was developed as a way of trying to, in terms of an educational area and children coming into school, they very actively tried to measure community strengthening rather than focusing in on individual families. I don't know whether anyone's got experience and wants and is experiencing that in any way.
If I give I'll wait and see if anyone wants to jump in.
I think, Kathy, one of the things I was reflecting on is, and very much around those, what Penny's saying. Thanks, Penny, for your great session today.
That sounds like Catherine Howe somewhere, is that right? Just introduce yourself as you
Yeah, sorry, Catherine Howe from Bethany in Geelong. I was thinking about, and thank you, Penny, for your contribution today. It's been fabulous, but how we need to think about the structural things, and then whilst we're doing, enabling and allowing people to be finding their own equilibrium. And I was thinking about how in Best Start, which is an early intervention, looking very much at those early years, but how we were trying really to strengthen the local community, but also then realise the policies that were sitting in housing, where we're working in an area where there was a lot of transitional housing going on. So people were really sort of working to get people connected and whatever, but in fact the housing policy was shifting people around, and just that, the real importance about how our whole system joins up. And, that's a really, and, once that was seen, that actually, to the local areas credit, they changed that and did it. Now, how much we hold that then becomes, I think, a really important tenet that we then as our system developers think about all the time, because just how quickly you can undermine another strategy. And my contribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's almost done sometimes inadvertently, though sometimes I think it's very actively done as well. Like actually the system of community development run from family services was actively defunded to shift to earlier intervention rather than early intervention back in the early 2000s. And, there's a lot of grief at the time within the family services sector. And now we're sort of trying to rebuild, aren't we, in different ways. And I don't know whether we should look nostalgically back or whether, in fact, it's grappling with new and maybe more, looking at whether that's sort of, we need to redevelop, and people are, I think, all over the place doing those sorts of redevelopments. But it would be good to hear just a little bit more about that from people who've been really excited by what they've been hearing from Penny, because we've got 2 more minutes. So one more person, just let's hear.
Yeah, it's just Deb here. I was in a group where we had a departmental colleague, sector colleagues, and I think that COVID has really started to help elucidate some of the things that Penny talked about, to be honest. The value of local, the empowerment of communities who really, to be honest, some of the successes of COVID have been the successes of communities. They've not been the successes of me or necessarily even government on their own. I mean, without communities rising to do the things they've done, we wouldn't have 0 cases and 0 deaths today. So I think that what we've got to hope is that we can not lose that. And I mean, I suppose from my perspective, Penny, and from a New Zealand point of view, do you think then you'd have had some similar experiences about the power of community during COVID? Have you been able to hold on to that in a social policy sense to help take, because I think we're all scared we might lose some of that here in Victoria.
I think both. So I think in some ways there's been a very rapid power sharing, not necessarily intentionally, and then a bit of a snapback as we come back. But also there's definitely huge numbers of people working across government and with community to capture those learnings and to try and say, okay, what does that look like to continue that relationship? You know, but some of the things that show up, we just, you know, we catch ourselves because we had lots of open conversations during that time. What do you need? What's happening? Daily briefings, open up with the whole sector. Pretty quick to return to being fearful about, well, we can't really have those conversations because, you know, they're competitors for funding. And so, you know, you just have to really watch how fast we fall back into that habit of not, I guess, being behind the shared motivation for outcomes together. But there's definitely efforts to embed that. I also think, and this is something that we're really trying to, I guess, actively support, is that want to respond immediately and say, we know that there's need, here's some things that we can do, but unfortunately not necessarily taking the time to say, are these actually things that were compounding before the issues? So we've really got to watch that balance of needing to react and wanting to put money into things with actually whether or not there's a meaningful demonstrated value in that. So yeah, the sense of urgency also needs to be balanced by really looking at it through an equity lens is our, I guess, our challenge, and a connected one, as someone pointed out, that holistic view, which is only a problem from a European perspective, not from an Indigenous worldview. It's us having to rebuild that into colonial systems. But yeah, that's my final two cents.
Penny, I think that's a terrific note to finish on, this notion of reconnection, thinking holistically and thinking of where we've got some of our best examples of that, particularly within our Indigenous communities, is actually, you know, a great place to finish this this presentation from you. And I think you've made and helped us really get off to an exciting start for the Open Symposium. So thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. It's been terrific work. Thank you, and look forward to seeing people across the week. Thank you, Penny.
Have a great week, everyone. Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you, Penny. That was terrific. It's just Deb here. Thank you so much.